We've all felt that crushing moment when we're about to be vulnerable with someone we care about, only to find ourselves focusing on our flaws instead of our hearts. Clara Mitchell knew that feeling all too well as she stood in the Colorado wilderness of 1880, face to face with Jake Thornton, a mountain man the townsfolk feared and whispered about. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with a reputation for violence, Jake was the kind of man mothers warned their daughters about. But when Clara found herself alone with him under the moonlight, something unexpected happened. As she leaned in for what might be their first and last kiss, her insecurity took over. She whispered a warning about her breath, expecting him to pull away like so many others had. But Jake just smiled. What happens when someone sees past your worst fears about yourself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and coming snow across Pine Ridge, Colorado, where Clara Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Her father's pocket watch ticked steadily on the kitchen table behind her, the only sound in a house that had grown far too quiet since Judge Henry Mitchell's passing 6 months prior. The watch had been his most treasured possession, a gift from Clara's grandfather, and now it served as both comfort and burden, marking time in a life that seemed suspended between what was and what might be. Clara pressed her palm against the cool glass, her breath fogging the window as she gazed toward the distant peaks where Jake Thornton was said to make his home. The townspeople spoke of him in hushed tones, their voices dropping to whispers when children were near. "That mountain devil," old Mrs. Henderson called him at Sunday service. 7 feet of pure meanness," Sheriff Morrison would mutter over his coffee at the general store. But Clara had seen something different in those brief moments when their paths had crossed in town. A gentleness in his eyes that seemed at odds with the fearsome reputation that preceded him like storm clouds. The Mitchell house sat on the better side of Pine Ridge, a testament to her father's standing in the community. Judge Mitchell had been a fair man, respected by ranchers and merchants alike, and his sudden death from a heart attack had left not just Clara orphaned, but the entire town without its moral compass. At 26, Clara found herself the sole inheritor of property that included the house, a small ranch, and her father's considerable library, a collection that made her one of the most educated women in 3 counties, though society offered her precious few ways to use that education. The morning ritual of checking the ranch had become both necessary and therapeutic. Clara wrapped her father's old coat around her shoulders and stepped into the crisp air, her boots crunching on frost-covered grass. The horses nickered softly as she approached the stable, their warm breath creating small clouds in the cold air. Thunder, her father's favorite stallion, pressed his great head against her shoulder in greeting, a gesture that still brought tears to her eyes months after the funeral. "Good morning, old friend," she whispered, stroking his neck. Thunder had been her father's companion on countless rides through the mountain trails, and now he seemed as lost as Clara herself. She fed the horses with practiced efficiency, but her mind wandered to the conversation she'd overheard at Garrett's general store the day before. "That Mitchell girl needs a husband," Mrs. Garrett had declared to a circle of nodding women. "It ain't proper. A young woman living alone like that invites all sorts of trouble." "Thomas Brennan's been calling on her regular," replied Sarah's mother, Mrs. Coleman. "His father owns the bank, you know. Good match for someone in Clara's position." Clara had hidden behind the pickle barrels, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger. Thomas Brennan was indeed a persistent suitor, polite, well-dressed, and utterly predictable. He spoke of investments and weather with equal passion, which was to say, none at all. When he looked at her, Clara felt as though he was calculating her value, like one of his father's loans. The thought of spending her life listening to Thomas discuss interest rates made her feel as trapped as Thunder must have felt in his stable. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. Clara looked up to see Thomas himself riding up the path, his posture as rigid as his character. He dismounted with mechanical precision, straightening his vest and running a hand through his perfectly combed hair. "Good morning, Clara," he said, his smile as practiced as a banker's handshake. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough, Thomas. What brings you out so early?" "Business, I'm afraid." He cleared his throat, a habit that preceded every serious conversation. "Father's been reviewing your father's accounts, and there are some matters that require attention. Perhaps we could discuss them over breakfast." Clara's stomach tightened. The Mitchell family had always maintained their independence, owing nothing to anyone. "What sort of matters?" "Nothing that can't be resolved with proper guidance," Thomas said, his tone suggesting that proper guidance was something she clearly lacked. "A woman shouldn't burden herself with such complexities. That's what husbands are for." The presumption in his voice made Clara's hands clench into fists. "I see, and you've appointed yourself to this position." Thomas's smile faltered slightly. "I had hoped. That is, I believe we could make an excellent partnership. You need protection, stability. I can provide both. What I need," Clara said carefully, "is to know exactly what business you believe requires your attention." Before Thomas could answer, another horse appeared at the edge of the property. This rider sat differently in the saddle, relaxed, confident, moving with his mount rather than perched on top of it. As the figure drew closer, Clara's heart began to race. Jake Thornton rode slowly up the path, his massive frame somehow graceful atop a horse that would have dwarfed most men. Thomas stepped closer to Clara, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "What's that savage want here?" Clara felt a flash of anger at the casual cruelty in Thomas's voice, but she kept her expression neutral. Jake stopped his horse a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his worn hat in greeting. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and surprisingly gentle. "Sorry to disturb. One of your fence posts is down near the creek. Thought you should know before your cattle wander." Up close, Jake was indeed imposing. Well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his buckskin shirt. His hair was longer than fashion dictated, dark brown with threads of silver at the temples that suggested he was older than the townspeople's stories made him seem. But it was his eyes that caught Clara's attention. Intelligent, kind eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing little. "Thank you," Clara managed. "That's very considerate." "Happy to fix it if you've got spare timber," Jake offered. "Won't take but an hour." Thomas stepped forward, his chest puffed with borrowed authority. "That won't be necessary. Miss Mitchell has people to handle such matters." Jake's gaze shifted to Thomas with calm assessment. "Didn't realize you were in the fence repair business, Brennan." "I'm not," Thomas said, his voice rising slightly. "But I am—" "You're not anything to me," Clara interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. She turned to Jake. "I would appreciate your help, Mr. Thornton. There's fresh timber behind the barn." Jake nodded once, dismounting with fluid grace. "Much obliged, ma'am." As Jake led his horse toward the barn, Thomas grabbed Clara's arm. Not roughly, but with the casual assumption of ownership that made her blood boil. "Clara, you can't seriously be allowing that animal to work on your property. People will talk. People already talk, Thomas, about everything and everyone." She pulled her arm free. "At least Mr. Thornton offers help instead of veiled threats about my finances." "It's not a threat," Thomas protested. "It's concern. This ranch, this house, they require a man's management. Father could help you see that everything is handled properly. For a price, I'm sure." Thomas's face reddened. "You're being unreasonable. I'm offering you security, respectability. What you're offering is control," Clara said quietly, "and I'm not interested in being managed like one of your father's investments." She left Thomas standing in her yard and walked toward the barn, where Jake was already examining the timber with the eye of someone who understood both wood and weather. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment their eyes met with an intensity that made Clara's breath catch. "Quality lumber," Jake said, running his hand along a pine board. Your father knew his materials. He built most of this place himself, Clara replied. Said a man should know the bones of his home. Wise words. Jake selected several boards and hefted them easily onto his shoulder. Sounds like he was a good man. He was. Clara found herself walking beside Jake as he headed toward the creek, leaving Thomas behind without a second thought. The town misses him. I imagine you miss him most of all. The simple acknowledgement of her grief, stated without pity or platitude, brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes. Yes, I do. They walked in comfortable silence through the aspen grove that bordered the creek, where indeed one of the fence posts had been knocked askew, probably by elk moving down from the high country. Jake set to work with tools from his saddlebags, his movements efficient and sure. You don't have to stay, he said without looking up from his work. Sure, your gentleman caller has more to say. Clara glanced back toward the house, where Thomas waited with obvious agitation. Let him wait. This is my property. Jake drove a new post into the ground with powerful measured strikes. Might cause you trouble. I seem to be collecting trouble lately. Sometimes troubles just change wearing work clothes, Jake replied, stretching wire between the posts. Question is whether you're ready for what comes with it. Clara watched his hands as he worked, large, capable hands that handled the tools with surprising delicacy. There were scars on those hands, she noticed, old white lines that spoke of hard work, and perhaps harder times. Mr. Thornton, she said carefully, what the people in town say about you, what do they say? That you're dangerous, that you've killed men. Jake's hands stilled on the wire. For a long moment he didn't speak, and Clara wondered if she'd overstepped. Then he straightened, meeting her eyes directly. I've killed men, he said simply. In war, in self-defense. But I've never killed a man who didn't need killing, and I've never hurt anyone who didn't hurt someone else first. He returned to his work. Don't know if that makes me dangerous or just careful. The honesty in his answer was more reassuring than any denial would have been. Clara found herself studying his profile as he finished securing the fence. The strong line of his jaw, the concentration in his expression, the way he seemed completely comfortable in his own skin, despite the world's judgment of him. There, Jake said, testing the fence's stability. Should hold through winter. Thank you. Clara realized she didn't want him to leave yet. Would you, that is, I have coffee on the stove if you'd like some. Jake looked toward the house where Thomas still waited with obvious impatience. Might not be wise, your suitor looks ready to call the sheriff. Thomas Brennan is not my suitor, Clara said with more heat than she'd intended. And this is my home. I'll invite whoever I please for coffee. A small smile played at the corners of Jake's mouth, the first she'd seen from him. In that case, ma'am, I'd be honored. As they walked back toward the house together, Clara felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening in a room that had been locked too long. Behind them, the repaired fence stood straight and strong, a testament to the value of honest work and simple kindness. Ahead waited whatever consequences came from choosing authenticity over expectation. Thomas met them at the porch, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. Clara, I really must insist. Good day, Thomas, Clara said firmly, holding the door open for Jake. I believe our business is concluded. As she closed the door behind them, leaving Thomas sputtering in the yard, Clara caught her father's pocket watch ticking steadily on the kitchen table. Time, she realized, didn't just mark what was ending. It also measured what was beginning. 3 weeks after Jake had mended her fence, the storm arrived with the fury that only high country weather could muster. Clara had been checking the cattle. In the far pasture, when the first lightning split the sky, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very mountains, the wind came next, bending the aspens nearly horizontal and driving the first fat raindrops like bullets against her face. She urged thunder into a gallop, racing the storm toward home, but the tempest moved faster than any horse. Within minutes, the world turned dark as twilight, and rain began falling in sheets so thick she could barely see thunder's ears. Lightning cracked overhead with terrifying frequency, and Clara knew with sinking certainty that she wouldn't make it home before. The worst hit. The old lion shack appeared through the curtain of rain, like a gift from Providence. Clara had ridden past it countless times, a small cabin her father had used during roundups, sitting in a grove of pines about halfway between the house and the high pastures. She guided Thunder toward it gratefully, but as they drew closer, smoke rising from the chimney told her someone else had already claimed shelter. Clara hesitated. The storm was growing worse by the minute, and Thunder was already shivering beneath her. Lightning struck a tree less than 100 yards away, the crack and crash making both horse and rider jump. There was no choice. She dismounted and led Thunder to the small lean-to that served as a stable, where she found another horse already waiting, a sturdy bay that she recognized as Jake Thornton's mount. Her heart began beating faster, and not just from the storm. The door opened before she could knock, and Jake filled the doorway, his expression shifting from wariness to concern when he saw her. "Clara, Miss Mitchell," he corrected himself quickly. "You're soaked through. Come in." The cabin was small but warm, with a fire crackling in the stone fireplace and Jake's coffee pot steaming on the hearth. Clara's mother's wedding dress hung in her saddlebags, wrapped in oilcloth for protection. But even that hadn't been enough. When she pulled it out to check for damage, her heart sank. The delicate lace at the bodice was torn, and water stains darkened the ivory silk in several places. "Oh no," she whispered, holding up the dress. It had been her most treasured possession, saved for the day she might wear it herself. Now it hung limp and damaged in her hands. Jake noticed her distress. "Family heirloom? My mother's wedding dress. I was taking it to Mrs. Patterson for cleaning before." She stopped, not wanting to explain that she'd been considering Thomas's persistent proposals, thinking perhaps it was time to be practical rather than romantic. "Before what?" Clara looked at the ruined dress, then at Jake's kind eyes reflecting firelight. "Before I made a terrible mistake." Jake took the dress gently from her hands, examining the damage with surprising knowledge. "Silk's tough. Lace can be mended. Water won't hurt either one permanently if they're dried proper." He hung the dress carefully near the fire, positioning it to catch the warmth without direct heat. Clara watched his large hands handle the delicate fabric with reverence, and something tight in her chest began to loosen. "You know about women's clothing?" A shadow crossed Jake's face. "Had a sister once. She was handy with a needle. Taught me some things." He cleared his throat and moved away from the dress. "You should get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." Clara looked down at herself, suddenly aware that her riding dress was plastered to her body, her hair hanging in wet ropes around her shoulders. "I don't have anything else." Jake turned his back and pulled a clean shirt from his pack. "This'll do until your thing's dry. I'll step outside in this storm." "Don't be ridiculous." Clara accepted the shirt gratefully. "Just turn around and keep your eyes on that fire." As she changed behind him, Clara found herself studying the broad line of his shoulders, the way his hair curled slightly at his collar. "Jake," she said softly, "what the people in town say about you being dangerous, why do you let them think that?" His shoulders tensed. "Sometimes it's easier to be what people expect than to fight their expectations. That's a lonely way to live. Loneliness is safer than disappointment." Clara pulled his shirt over her head, breathing in the scent of pine and leather that clung to the fabric. It fell to her knees like a dress, and she felt strangely intimate, wearing something that had touched his skin. "You can turn around now." Jake faced her, and for a moment neither spoke. Clara was acutely aware of how she must look. Barefoot, swimming in his oversized shirt, her hair loose and drying in waves around her face. But instead of embarrassment, she felt a curious sense of freedom, as if the storm had washed away more than just the dust of the trail. "Tell me about your sister," she said, settling on the floor near the fire. Jake's jaw tightened. "Nothing good comes from digging up the dead. Sometimes it helps to share the burden." For a long moment, only the storm spoke. Wind howling around the cabin, rain drumming on the roof, thunder rolling across the mountains like the footsteps of giants. Then Jake sat down across from her, his eyes fixed on the flames. Her name was Mary. She was younger than me by 5 years, but twice as smart as anyone had a right to be. Could read before she was 4, write poetry that would make grown men weep. His voice was quiet, controlled. When the war came, I enlisted to keep food on the table, left her with my uncle's family in Kansas. Clara waited, sensing there was more. Came home 3 years later to find she'd died of scarlet fever. My uncle, Jake's hands clenched into fists. He'd sold her belongings to pay his debts. Everything she'd ever owned, including the dresses she'd sewn herself. Only thing left was a letter she'd written me before she died. What did it say? Jake pulled a folded paper from his pocket, worn soft from years of handling. That she forgave me for leaving, that she understood why I had to go, that she hoped I'd find someone who'd love me the way Papa loved Mama before they died. Tears stung Clara's eyes. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was the best person I've ever known. And I failed her. Jake refolded the letter carefully. After that, I figured I was better off alone. Couldn't fail anyone else if I didn't let them get close. But that's not living, Jake. That's just surviving. Sometimes surviving is enough, is it? Clara leaned forward, her heart aching for the pain she heard in his voice. Your sister wanted you to find love. She wanted you to be happy. By shutting yourself away, you're not honoring her memory. You're wasting the life she died believing. In Jake's eyes met hers across the firelight, and Clara saw the moment when her words hit home. The careful walls he'd built around himself wavered, and she caught a glimpse of the man he might have been if grief hadn't carved him into something harder. What about you? He asked quietly. What are you surviving instead of living? The question caught Clara off guard. She thought of Thomas's persistent proposals, of the townspeople's expectations, of the life she was supposed to want. Safe, predictable, proper. I'm afraid, she admitted. Afraid of making the wrong choice. Afraid of ending up trapped in a life that feels like dying slowly. What would the right choice look like? Clara studied his face. The strong bones, the gentle eyes, the mouth, that seemed made for both tenderness and laughter. I don't know, but I think it would feel like this. Like what? Like coming alive. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, something new was taking root. Fragile and precious as the first green shoots of spring. Jake reached across the space between them and touched her hand, his fingers tracing the calluses. She'd earned working her father's ranch. Clara, you should know, I'm not the kind of man who makes pretty promises or knows how to court a lady proper. I don't want pretty promises, Clara replied, turning her hand to catch his fingers with hers. I want honesty. I want someone who sees me as I am, not as what I should be. Then you should also know that being close to me won't be easy. The town doesn't get to choose who I care about. Jake's thumb brushed across her knuckles, sending warmth shooting up her arm. And if I told you I've been thinking about you every day since I fixed your fence, I'd say I've been thinking about you too. The confession seemed to surprise them both. Clara felt as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff, and Jake was offering to jump with her into something unknown and potentially wonderful. When the storm finally passed near dawn, Clara dressed in her dried clothes reluctantly, knowing that leaving the cabin meant returning to a world that wouldn't understand what had passed between them. Jake helped her saddle Thunder, their hands brushing as he checked the cinch. Clara, he said as she prepared to mount, what happens now? She looked back at the little cabin where they'd shared more truth in one night than she'd spoken in years. Of polite conversation. Her mother's wedding dress was carefully folded in her saddlebags, and while it still bore the marks of the storm, somehow it no longer seemed damaged, just changed, like everything else. I don't know, she said honestly, but I know I'm not the same person who rode into that storm yesterday. As she rode toward home, Clara felt the weight of her father's pocket watch in her saddlebags and realized that some storms didn't just bring destruction. Sometimes they cleared the air for something new to grow. The chess set was the first thing Clara noticed when she returned to Jake's cabin 3 days later. Hand-carved from what appeared to be different types of mountain wood, aspen for the light pieces, dark walnut for the others. It sat on a small table near the window, the afternoon sunlight revealing the intricate detail of each figure. The knight's mane seemed to flow with life. The queen's crown was delicately scalloped, and even the humble pawns bore individual characteristics that spoke of hours of careful work. Clara had told herself she was merely returning Jake's shirt, cleaned and pressed, but the truth was more complicated. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about their conversation during the storm, about the way he'd looked at her when she'd admitted to thinking about him. The proper thing would have been to send the shirt with one of the ranch hands, but Clara found she had little patience left for propriety. Jake emerged from behind the cabin, carrying an armload of firewood, and Clara's breath caught at the sight of him. In town, surrounded by whispers and fearful glances, he'd seemed larger than life, almost mythical. Here in his own element, he simply seemed like a man, a very appealing man, who moved with unconscious grace and looked genuinely pleased to see her. "Clara," he said, setting down the wood. "Wasn't expecting company. I brought your shirt." She held out the carefully folded garment. "And I wanted to thank you again for the shelter and for listening." Jake accepted the shirt, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. "No thanks needed. Storm would have been dangerous to ride in." Clara nodded toward the chess set. "Did you carve those yourself?" A hint of self-consciousness crossed Jake's features. "Winter project. Gets quiet up here when the snow comes." "They're beautiful. Do you play?" "Some." "You?" "My father taught me." Clara moved closer to examine the pieces. "I haven't had a proper opponent since he died. These mountains don't produce many chess players," Jake said with a slight smile. "Would you like a game?" They settled on opposite sides of the small table, and Clara found herself studying Jake as he considered his opening move. The townspeople's image of him as a savage seemed absurd in this setting. His cabin was small but well organized, with books lining makeshift shelves and careful attention to detail evident everywhere. This was the home of a thoughtful man, not the wild creature of local legend. "Your move," Jake said, having advanced. "A pawn," Clara responded automatically, her mind more focused on her surroundings than the game. "Jake, where did you learn to read and to carve like this?" "Army, mostly. Had a sergeant who believed educated soldiers were better soldiers. After the war," he paused, moving his knight. "Had time to practice. What did you do before the war?" Jake's hand hesitated over his next piece. "Family had a small farm in Missouri, nothing fancy, but we grew enough to get by. I was going to be a teacher, believe it or not." Clara looked up from the board in surprise. "A teacher? Hard to picture." "I know, but I liked books, liked the idea of helping children learn." His voice carried a note of old pain. "War changed those plans." "It doesn't have to stay changed." Jake captured one of her pawns with more force than necessary. "Look around, Clara. You see any schools up here? Any children who need teaching?" "There are settlements in the high valleys, mining camps with families. Children who've never seen the inside of a schoolhouse. And what school board is going to hire someone with my reputation?" Clara moved her queen, a bold attack that surprised them both. "Maybe reputation isn't as permanent as you think." The game continued in comfortable silence for a while, but Clara found herself watching Jake more than the board. There was something mesmerizing about his concentration, the way his large hands moved the delicate pieces with surprising gentleness. When he smiled at a particularly clever move she made, her heart did something complicated in her chest. "Check," she announced, moving her bishop. Jake studied the board with renewed interest. "Didn't see that coming. Father always said the best strategies are the ones your opponent doesn't expect." "Smart man. Your father." Jake castled to safety. "What would he think of you being here?" The question caught Clara off guard. She considered it seriously. picturing her father's weathered face, remembering his quiet wisdom, and his belief in judging people by their actions rather than their reputations. "I think he'd like you," she said finally. "He always said a man's character shows in how he treats those who can't benefit him. You helped me during the storm, expecting nothing in return. Maybe I expected something." Clara's pulse quickened. "What?" The pleasure of your company. The simple honesty of the statement made Clara's cheeks warm. She moved a piece at random, barely seeing the board. "Jake, I need to tell you something. Thomas Brennan has been, that is, he's asked. He's proposed. Not exactly, but he's made it clear that he expects an answer soon. His father's been pressuring him to settle down, and apparently I'm suitable." Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Suitable. That's the word he used. Clara couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. Suitable for his position, his family's expectations. Not loved, not cherished, just suitable. "And what answer will you give him?" Clara met Jake's eyes across the chessboard. "I don't know. A week ago I might have said yes. It would be the safe choice, the expected choice. And now I've seen what it feels like to have a real conversation with a man who sees me as more than a decorative addition to his life." Jake reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Clara, you should know, whatever this is between us, it won't be easy. This town has made up its mind about me. Then maybe it's time to change their minds. People don't change their minds easy, especially about things that scare them. What scares them about you?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "I'm not like them. Don't think like them. Don't want the same things they want. That makes me unpredictable, and unpredictable is dangerous in their world." "What do you want, Jake?" He looked at her then, with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Right now, I want to forget about chess and show you the view from the ridge behind the cabin. I want to hear you laugh, really laugh, not the polite sound you make in town. I want to kiss you properly, not because we're caught in a storm, but because I can't stop thinking about how you felt in my arms." Clara's heart was racing now, but not with fear. "Then why don't you?" Jake stood slowly, never breaking eye contact. "Because once I do, there's no going back to polite conversations and proper distance." Clara rose to meet him, the chess pieces forgotten on the table between them. "Maybe I don't want to go back." When Jake kissed her, it was nothing like the desperate, storm-driven moment they'd shared in the cabin. This was deliberate, gentle, and infinitely more dangerous to her peace of mind. His hands framed her face as though she were something precious, and Clara felt herself melting into him with a rightness that made everything else in her life seem like mere preparation for this moment. When they finally broke apart, Clara rested, her forehead against his chest, listening to the rapid beat of his heart. "The view from the ridge," she said breathlessly. "I'd like to see it." Jake's laugh was low and warm. "I was hoping you'd say that." As they walked hand in hand up the mountain path, Clara thought about the chess game they'd abandoned and realized that sometimes the most important moves were the ones you didn't plan, the ones that changed the entire game with their unexpected audacity. Clara's mother's recipe book lay open on Jake's rough-hewn table, its pages yellowed with age, but the handwriting still clear and strong. Clara traced her finger along the margin notes her mother had made, small observations about which herbs grew best at high altitude, how to preserve vegetables through the harsh mountain winters, remedies for everything from fever to heartbreak. She knew these mountains, Clara said softly. Mother came here as a bride from Boston, but she learned to love this land. Jake leaned over her shoulder to read the recipe for wild rose hip tea, his presence warm and comforting. Smart woman, Rose. Hips'll keep scurvy away when fresh fruit's scarce. They'd been meeting like this for 2 weeks now. Clara bringing supplies and conversation, Jake sharing his knowledge of mountain survival and the comfortable rhythm of a life lived close to the land. What had started as stolen hours was becoming Something deeper, more necessary than breathing. Teach me, Clara said suddenly. Teach you what? Everything. How to live up here, how to be self-sufficient, how to survive without depending on town gossips and bankers' sons. Jake's expression grew serious. Clara, that's not a game. Mountain life is hard, dangerous. One mistake can kill you. Then, don't let me make mistakes. The quiet conviction in her voice seemed to surprise him. Jake studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but we start with the basics, and you do exactly what I tell you. The first lesson was fire building in wet conditions, a skill that could mean the difference between life and death if caught in sudden weather. Jake watched with patient attention as Clara struggled with damp kindling, offering gentle corrections when she arranged the wood wrong or tried to rush the process. Fire's like trust, he said, as her third attempt finally caught and held. Takes, and time to build proper, but once it's burning true, it'll keep you warm through the worst storms. Clara understood he wasn't just talking about fire. How long did it take you to trust me? About 5 seconds after you defended me to Brennan, Jake admitted. But trusting myself with you, that's taking longer. They moved on to plant identification, walking through the forest, while Jake pointed out edible roots, medicinal herbs, and the subtle signs that warned of poisonous lookalikes. Clara proved to be a quick student, her educated mind adapting easily to this different kind of learning. Your mother's book mentions Devil's Club, Jake said, kneeling beside a plant with broad maple-like leaves. Good for infections, cuts that won't heal. But you've got to know how to harvest it without getting yourself cut to pieces. He showed her how to approach the thorny plant, how to take only what was needed while leaving the rest to grow. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but Clara noticed the old scars on his fingers and palms, evidence of lessons learned the hard way. Where did you learn all this? Trial and error, mostly. Army taught me some, but mountain survival is different from battlefield medicine. Jake wrapped the harvested bark carefully in a cloth. Had an old Ute man help me my first winter up here. Probably saved my life 12 times over. What happened to him? Died peaceful in his sleep 3 winters back. Good death for a good man. Jake's voice carried respect and sadness. He said the mountains choose who gets to stay and who gets sent back to the flatlands. Guess they chose me. What about me? Will they choose me? Jake looked at her for a long moment, taking in her determined expression, the way she'd adapted to their unusual courtship without complaint or demands for conventional romance. I think they already have. The afternoon's final lesson was the most practical: how to dress a wound properly. Jake had noticed Clara wince when she gripped the axe handle during fire building, and investigation revealed a deep splinter embedded in her palm. "This'll hurt," he warned, producing a sharp knife from his belt. "I'm not made of spun glass, Jake," but when the knife point touched her skin, Clara couldn't suppress a sharp intake of breath. Jake's hands stilled immediately. "I'm all right," she insisted. "Keep going." Instead, Jake set down the knife and took her injured hand gently in both of his. "There's no shame in admitting when something hurts, Clara. Courage isn't about not feeling pain. It's about facing it honest." The tenderness in his voice nearly undid her. Clara felt tears threaten, not from the physical pain, but from the overwhelming relief of being with someone who saw strength and vulnerability as partners rather than enemies. "I'm not used to being taken care of," she whispered. "I know. Your whole life you've been the one doing the caring, for your father, for the ranch, for everyone's expectations of what a proper lady should be." Jake's thumbs traced gentle circles on her wrists. "But you don't have to carry everything alone." When he removed the splinter, his touch was so gentle Clara barely felt it. He cleaned the wound with spring water and wrapped it with strips of clean cloth, his movements sure and caring. "There, but you'll need to keep it clean and dry for a few days." Clara flexed her fingers experimentally. "Thank you. For what? For seeing me. The real me, not the version everyone else wants." Jake cupped her face in his hands, his eyes serious. "Clara, you should know what I feel for you. It's not something I can take back or pretend away. If you're not sure about this, about us, you need to tell me now." Instead of answering with words, Clara rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her certainty and growing love into the connection between them. When they broke apart, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I should take you home before people start talking." "People are already talking. Mrs. Henderson saw me riding toward the mountains yesterday and made sure everyone at church knew about it." Jake's expression darkened. "Clara, if this is causing you problems in town, the only problem I have is Thomas Brennan cornering me after service to demand an explanation for my unseemly behavior. What did you tell him?" "That my behavior is none of his business, and neither is my company." Clara smiled at the memory. He didn't take it well. Men like Brennan don't like being told no by women they consider their property. "I'm not his property. I'm not anyone's property." "No, you're not." Jake's voice was fierce with pride and something deeper. "You're your own woman, and any man worth having would know that." As the sun began to set, Jake walked Clara to where Thunder waited patiently. Before she mounted, he caught her hand. "Clara, I need you to promise me something. If this gets too difficult, if the town pressure becomes too much, you'll tell me. Don't try to handle it alone." Clara squeezed his hand. "Only if you promise me the same thing. No more hiding in these mountains because you think you don't deserve happiness. That's a hard promise to make. But will you make it?" Jake looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "For you, I'll try." As Clara rode home through the gathering dusk, her mother's recipe book safely tucked in her saddlebags, she felt a new sense of purpose settling in her bones. The lessons Jake had taught her weren't just about survival. They were about living deliberately, honestly, on her own terms. The lights of Pine Ridge twinkled in the valley below, but Clara found herself looking back toward the mountains where Jake lived, where she was beginning to understand she belonged. The military medal was tucked away in a small wooden box beneath Jake's spare blankets, wrapped in the same cloth that had once held his sister's letter. Clara discovered it by accident while helping him organize supplies for winter, her fingers finding the hard metal shape when she was folding wool. "Jake," she said quietly, holding up the bronze star with its faded ribbon. "You never mentioned—" Jake's face went carefully blank, the same expression Clara had seen him wear in town when people whispered behind their hands. "Didn't seem important." Clara turned the medal over in her palm, reading the inscription. "Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." She looked up at him with new understanding. "This is the highest military decoration there is. It's a piece of metal for doing things I'd rather forget. What did you do to earn it?" Jake was quiet for so long, Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sat heavily on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped between his knees. "Battle of Stones River, January 1863. My unit was pinned down by Confederate artillery, taking heavy casualties. Command ordered retreat, but there were wounded men trapped in no man's land." His voice was flat, emotionless. "I went back for them. Made 4 trips across open ground under heavy fire. Brought out 17 men. That's extraordinary, Jake. You saved 17 lives. Lost 12 others who might have lived if I'd been faster, smarter." Jake's jaw tightened. "Medals don't bring back the dead, Clara. They just remind you of who didn't make it home." Clara carefully rewrapped the medal and placed it back in the box. "Is that why you came to the mountains? Survivor's guilt?" "Part of it." Jake stood and moved to the window, his back to her. "After the war, I tried to go back to normal life. Worked in a factory in Chicago for a while, tried to court a nice girl, pretend the war never happened. But I'd wake up screaming from nightmares, or I'd hear a loud noise and hit the ground like shells were falling." "What happened to the girl?" "Sarah. Sweet thing, daughter of a shopkeeper. Deserved better than a broken soldier who jumped at shadows." Jake's voice carried old pain. "She tried to understand, but how do you explain that the sound of church bells makes you think of artillery? That you can't sleep next to another person because you might hurt them when the dreams come?" Clara felt her heart breaking for him. So you came here, figured I was dangerous to be around. Mountains don't judge you for being damaged, don't. Expect you to be something you're not. He turned back to her. At least they didn't until you showed up. And now? Now I remember what I was fighting for in the first place. The idea that good people deserve to live free, to love who they choose, to build something better than what came before. Clara moved to stand beside him at the window, looking out at the valley where the first snows were beginning to dust the high peaks. You're not damaged, Jake. You're a man who's seen terrible things and survived them. That takes strength, not weakness. Some days, I'm not so sure. Then let me be sure for both of us. Jake turned to face her, and Clara saw something vulnerable in his eyes that made her breath catch. Clara, there are things about me, about what I've done. I don't care what you've done. I care who you are now with me. But if people knew, if they found out about the medal, about why I really came here, they'd realize they've been fools for judging you without knowing the truth. Clara reached up to cup his face in her hands. You're a hero, Jake. Maybe not the kind that gets parades and speeches, but the kind that matters. The kind that saves people. I didn't save Mary. You couldn't save Mary. There's a difference. Clara's voice was gentle but firm. You can't carry guilt for every life you couldn't save, not when you've spent yours saving others. Jake caught her hands in his, pressing them against his chest, where she could feel his heart beating fast and hard. Sometimes, when I'm with you, I can almost believe that's true. Believe it always. They stood together in the fading light, and Clara felt the weight of all Jake's hidden pain, the burden he'd carried alone for so many years. She understood now why he'd chosen isolation, why he'd let the town believe he was dangerous rather than reveal the truth of his service and sacrifice. The nightmares, she said carefully, do you still have them? Less often. Being here, having purpose again, it helps. Jake hesitated. Being with you helps most of all. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. Clara, you should understand. If we build a life together, it won't always be easy. Some nights I might not sleep. Some days I might need to be alone to remember how to be human again. And some days I might need to cry for my father or rage at the unfairness of losing him so young. Clara smiled softly. We all have wounds, Jake. The question is whether we heal them together or let them fester in isolation. Jake pulled her into his arms then, holding her with the desperate tenderness of a man who'd thought he'd lost the right to gentle things. Clara felt his face press into her hair, felt the careful control he maintained begin to crack just slightly. I love you, he whispered against her temple. God help me, I love you more than I thought I could love anything. I love you too, Clara replied, the words coming as naturally as breathing. All of you. The hero and the broken places, the gentleness and the scars. When Jake kissed her, it was with a passion that spoke of months of careful restraint finally. Giving way, Clara responded with equal fervor, pouring all her understanding and acceptance into the connection between them. They were both breathing hard when they broke apart. Clara, Jake said roughly, if we keep this up, I know what I'm doing. Do you? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to proper courtship and chaperoned visits. Clara looked at this man who'd been willing to die for strangers, who'd carved her a chess set with his own hands, who saw her strength instead of her compliance as something to be treasured. I crossed that line the night of the storm, she said simply. Everything since then has just been finding the courage to admit it. Jake's eyes darkened with desire and something deeper. Then stay tonight. Let me show you what it means to be loved by someone who sees exactly who you are. As the first snow began to fall outside, Clara made her choice. Not the safe one, not the expected one, but the one that felt like coming home to herself at last. The teaching certificate was yellowed, with age, carefully preserved in Clara's father's desk, alongside his law books and personal papers. Clara held it up to the lamplight, reading her own name in formal script. Clara Elizabeth Mitchell, certified to teach children grades 1 through 8 in the territory of Colorado. She'd earned it 2 years before her father's death, but there had never been an opportunity to use it. Pine Ridge already had a school mom, and proper young ladies didn't seek employment outside their hometown. Now, as she sat in her father's study with Jake's latest letter spread on the desk before her, the certificate felt like a key to a door she'd forgotten existed. The letter was brief, but troubling. Jake had pulled back after their night together, his words careful and distant. He'd been thinking, he wrote, about her future and her reputation. Perhaps it would be better if she didn't visit for a while, until he could sort through some things. Clara crumpled the letter in frustration. She understood Jake's protective instincts, but his noble self-sacrifice was infuriating. They'd found something real together, something worth fighting for, and he was trying to throw it away because he thought he wasn't good enough for her. A knock at the door interrupted her brooding. Sarah Coleman stood on the porch, her usually cheerful face creased with concern. "Clara, we need to talk." Over tea in the kitchen, Sarah delivered the news Clara had been dreading. "The whole town's buzzing about you and that mountain man. Mrs. Henderson saw you riding toward his place 3 times this week, and she's been telling anyone who'll listen that you've lost your mind." "Mrs. Henderson needs to mind her own business. It's not just her, Clara. People are worried about you. They think he's taken advantage of your grief, made you believe things that aren't true." Clara set down her teacup with enough force to rattle the saucer. "What things?" "That he cares about you, that his intentions are honorable." Sarah reached across the table. "Clara, men like that don't marry women like us. They use us and disappear when the novelty wears off." "Men like what, Sarah?" "Good men, honest men. Men who see women as more than decorative objects. Dangerous men. Wild men who live outside civilization for a reason." Clara stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "Jake Thornton is the most civilized man I've ever known. He's educated, thoughtful, gentle. He's also killed people. In war, defending his country and fellow soldiers. That makes him a hero, not a monster." Sarah looked shocked. "How do you know about his military service?" Clara realized her mistake too late. Jake's past was his secret to share, not hers. "I know because I took the time to actually talk to him instead of listening to gossip." "Clara, listen to yourself. You're defending a man you barely know against people who care about you." "I know him better than you think." "Do you? Do you know why he really came to these mountains? What he's running from?" "He's not running from anything. He's building a life. Alone, Clara. He chose to live alone for a reason." The words hit closer to home than Clara wanted to admit. Jake had pulled away after their night together, had written that careful, distant letter. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe she'd imagined a connection that wasn't really there. But then she remembered the way Jake had looked at her when she'd found his medal, the vulnerability in his eyes when he'd told her about his sister. That hadn't been pretense or manipulation. That had been a man letting down his guard with someone he trusted. "Sarah, I appreciate your concern, I really do. But I'm not a child who needs protecting from her own choices." "Then what about your position in this community? Your father's reputation? If you keep this up, you'll be unmarriageable. No decent man will have you." "Maybe I don't want a decent man. Maybe I want a good one." Sarah sighed heavily. "I'm trying to help you, Clara. Thomas Brennan is still willing to marry you, despite the talk. His father's bank could ensure your financial security in exchange for what? My independence? My self-respect?" Clara turned back to the window. "Thomas Brennan looks at me the way a man looks at a horse he's considering buying. He calculates my value in terms of my father's property and my ability to run his household without complaint. That's what marriage is, Clara. Partnership, practical arrangement. That's what you've been told marriage is. But I've seen something different." After Sarah left, Clara sat alone in her father's study, turning the teaching certificate over in her hands. An idea was forming, dangerous and appealing in equal measure. There were mining settlements in the high valleys, families with children who'd never seen the inside of a school. Jake had mentioned them during one of their conversations about his abandoned teaching dreams. What if she could create something new? A school in the mountains, serving the children that the formal education system ignored. She had the qualifications, and Jake had the knowledge of mountain life that would make such a venture possible. It would mean leaving Pine Ridge, abandoning her father's house and the life everyone expected her to live. It would mean scandal and social exile, but it would also mean freedom, purpose, and the chance to build something meaningful with the man she loved. Clara pulled out paper and pen, beginning a letter that would change everything. 3 days later, she rode up to Jake's cabin with the teaching certificate in her saddlebag and determination in her heart. She found him splitting wood behind the cabin, his movements sharp and angry. He looked up at her approach, and Clara saw the careful distance he'd been maintaining reflected in his eyes. "Clara, I thought I asked you to stay away." "Yes, I got your letter." She dismounted and faced him squarely. "I'm here to tell you that you're being an idiot." Jake's axe bit deep into the chopping block. "I'm trying to protect you." "From what? Happiness? Love? A chance at something real? From making a mistake that'll ruin your life." Clara pulled the teaching certificate from her bag and held it out to him. "This is my life, Jake. My education, my dreams, my choices. And I choose you. I choose us." Jake looked at the certificate, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Clara, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about a school in the high country. Children who need education, families who need hope. Two people who love each other working together to build something worthwhile. The town will never forgive you. Then maybe it's time to find a new town. Or better yet, build our own." Jake set down the axe and moved toward her, his careful control finally cracking. "You'd give up everything. Your father's house, your position, your security." "I'd give up nothing. I'd be gaining everything that matters." When Jake kissed her this time, it wasn't with the gentle reverence of their previous encounters, but with the desperate passion of a man who'd been trying to push away the best thing in his life and couldn't do it anymore. "Are you sure?" he asked against her lips. "I've never been more sure of anything." As they held each other in the shadow of the mountains that would become their home, Clara felt her father's pocket watch ticking steadily in her pocket, not marking time lost, but time beginning. The land deed was tucked inside Jake's copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, a hiding place so unlikely that Clara might never have found it if the book hadn't fallen from the shelf while she was cleaning his cabin. The folded paper fluttered to the floor like a secret finally ready to be revealed. Clara picked it up innocently enough, intending simply to return it to the book, but her father's training in legal documents made her notice the official seal, the careful script that indicated something of importance. She unfolded it before she could stop herself, and what she read made her sink into Jake's chair with shock. The deed was for nearly 2,000 acres of mountain territory, including mineral rights to what appeared to be substantial silver deposits. The land was described in precise legal terms that Clara recognized from her father's work, but what stunned her was the signature at the bottom, Jacob William Thornton, dated 3 years prior, purchased for the sum of $50,000. Cash $50,000. More money than most people in Pine Ridge would see in a lifetime. More money than her father had earned in his entire career as a judge. And Jake had paid it in cash, which meant, find something interesting? Clara jumped, her heart racing. As Jake filled the doorway, his expression was carefully neutral, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders, as though he'd been dreading this moment. "Jake, this deed, I can explain." Clara stood slowly, the paper still in her hands. "You own all this land. The mineral rights alone must be worth a fortune." "Clara, you've been letting me worry about your future, about whether you could support a family, about what people would think of me marrying a poor mountain man." Her voice was rising despite her efforts to control it. "You've been lying. To me, I never lied to you. You let me believe you were barely scraping by up here. You let me worry about your prospects, your ability to provide, because I needed to know." Jake interrupted, his own voice sharp with frustration. "I needed to know if you cared about me or what I could give you." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "You were testing me? Every woman who's ever shown interest in me has had ulterior motives. My size, my reputation, the mystery of the dangerous mountain man, it attracts a certain type of person. But none of them wanted Jacob Thornton the man. They wanted what they thought I represented." Clara felt sick. "So you thought you'd test my character by deceiving me? I thought I'd learn who you really were, before I made the mistake of falling in love with someone who'd disappear the moment life got difficult. And what exactly did you learn?" Clara's voice was dangerously quiet. Jake stepped fully into the cabin, and she could see the pain in his eyes now, the fear that he'd ruined everything between them. "I learned that you're nothing like any woman I've ever met. I learned that you care more about honest conversation than expensive gifts, more about character than comfort. I learned that you'd rather mend fence with me than shop for wedding dresses with a banker's son. You learned all that by lying to me. I learned it by watching you choose me when you thought I had nothing to offer but myself." Clara sank back into the chair, the deed crumpled in her hands. $50,000, Jake. Where does someone like you get $50,000? Jake's jaw tightened. "You mean someone like me, who's supposed to be just a poor mountain savage?" "You." "No, that's not what I meant." "Do I? Because right now you're looking at me like I'm a stranger." Clara forced herself to really look at him, not at the deceiver, but at the man she'd fallen in love with. Yes, she was hurt and angry, but underneath that was something else. Relief, maybe, that the man she loved wasn't actually facing a future of poverty and struggle, confusion about why he'd felt the need to hide something that should have been cause for celebration. "Tell me," she said quietly. "Tell me where the money came from." Jake moved to the window, staring out at the land that was apparently his kingdom. "My grandfather left me some investments. Railroad stocks, mostly, bought cheap when everyone thought the Transcontinental Railroad was a fool's dream. When it became clear it wasn't, the value went through the roof. And you never mentioned this because the last woman I trusted, with that information, tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could get control of the money through marriage." Jake's voice was bitter. Sarah, the sweet shopkeeper's daughter from Chicago, turned out she'd been working with her father and a lawyer to have me committed to an asylum for war-related mental instability. They figured a man who talked to himself and had nightmares was clearly unfit to manage his own affairs. Clara felt her anger begin to shift toward understanding. "Oh, Jake, I found out about the plan the night before they were going to have me arrested. Left Chicago that very evening with nothing but what I could carry, came west, and eventually bought this land under an assumed name. Jake Thornton is close enough to my real name that I answer to it naturally, but different enough that anyone searching records won't find me easily. What's your real name? Jacob Thornton Williams. But Jake Thornton has been more honest than Jacob Williams ever was." Clara looked down at the deed again, seeing it now not as evidence of deception, but as proof of just how much Jake had risked by letting her into his life. "You could have stayed hidden forever. You didn't have to tell me anything." "No, I didn't. But I also couldn't keep lying to you, even by omission. Especially not if you're serious about building a life with me." "The school," Clara said suddenly. "With this kind of resources, we could build a real school. Hire other teachers, create something lasting." Jake turned from the window. "We?" Clara stood and moved to him, the deed still in her hand. "I'm angry that you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth from the beginning. I'm hurt that you felt the need to test my motives, but I understand why you did it, and I understand that you were protecting yourself from something that nearly destroyed you once before. Clara, I'm not finished." She pressed the deed against his chest. "I'm also relieved that the man I love won't have to struggle to survive up here, and that our children won't grow up wondering where their next meal is coming from. I'm excited about the possibilities this opens up for the school, for helping the families in these mountains. Jake covered her hand with his. And I need you to promise me something. No more secrets, no more tests. If we're going to build a life together, it has to be based on complete honesty, even when that honesty is difficult or inconvenient, even when it might change how you feel about me. Clara stood on her toes and kissed him softly. Especially then, Jake, I didn't fall in love with your prospects or your bank account. I fell in love with the man who carved me a chess set, who taught me to survive in the wilderness, who held me during a storm and made me feel safe for the first time since my father died. The money doesn't change that. The money changes our possibilities, not our feelings. We can do more good, help more people, build something bigger than either of us could create alone. Clara smiled, though I have to admit it's going to take some getting used to, being courted by one of the wealthiest men in Colorado. Jake's laugh was shaky with relief. Does this mean you forgive me? I forgive you. But Jake, if you ever test me again instead of trusting me with the truth, I'll use some of those mountain survival skills you taught me to make your life very uncomfortable. Understood? Jake pulled her into his arms. No more secrets. Good. Now show me the rest of these documents. If I'm going to help you manage this empire, I need to understand exactly what we're working with. As they spread the papers across Jake's table, Clara felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. They weren't just two lonely people finding solace in each other. They were partners with the resources and determination to change their corner of the world for the better. The lies were over. The real work was just beginning. Clara's father's law books proved invaluable in the weeks following the revelation of Jake's wealth. She spent hours poring over property law, mining rights and territorial legislation, building a comprehensive understanding of the legal framework that would govern their plans for the mountain school and the development of Jake's land. What she discovered in those leather-bound volumes was both encouraging and alarming. Jake's ownership of the land was legally sound, properly filed and witnessed. But there were loopholes in territorial law that could be exploited by unscrupulous parties, particularly if they could prove the original owner was mentally incompetent or had obtained the land through fraudulent means. Jake, Clara said one evening as they reviewed the documents by lamplight, have you registered your real name anywhere in Colorado territory? No. Been careful about that. Why? Clara pointed to a passage in one of her father's legal texts. Because if someone could prove that Jake Thornton doesn't legally exist, they could challenge your right to hold property under that name. They'd need to prove fraud or mental incompetence, but with the right legal maneuvering, they could steal everything. Jake's voice was grim. Sarah's father was a banker. He'd know these laws. Has anyone from Chicago been asking questions? About you? Not that I know of, but I've been living quietly, staying out of sight. If someone wanted to find me... A knock at the cabin door interrupted them. Jake moved immediately to the window, his hand instinctively going to the rifle propped against the wall. In the moonlight, they could see two figures on horseback. Sheriff Morrison, Jake identified, and Thomas Brennan. Clara felt her blood chill. At this hour, that's not a social call. Jake opened the door cautiously, keeping the rifle within easy reach. Sheriff Brennan, what brings you up here so late? Sheriff. Morrison looked uncomfortable, his hat in his hands. Sorry to disturb you folks, but I've got some official business that can't wait. Thomas pushed past the sheriff, his face flushed with anger and something that looked suspiciously like triumph. Don't apologize, Sheriff. We're dealing with a criminal here. What's this about? Clara stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. Thomas pulled a folded document from his coat. This is about fraud, Clara. This man has been lying to you, to all of us. His real name is Jacob Williams, and he's wanted in Chicago for theft and assault. Jake went very still. That's not true, isn't it? Thomas unfolded what appeared to be an official warrant. This says you attacked a prominent businessman and stole $50,000 before fleeing the state. It says you're mentally unstable, dangerous to yourself and others. Clara snatched the warrant from Thomas's hands, her legal training immediately noting several irregularities. This isn't an official warrant. It's not properly sealed, not signed by a territorial judge. It's signed by a judge in Illinois, Thomas interrupted, which makes it valid under territorial extradition law. Actually, it doesn't. Clara's voice was steady despite her racing heart. Extradition requires specific procedures, including validation by territorial authorities. This document has none of those validations. Sheriff Morrison looked between the three of them, clearly out of his depth. Look, I don't know about all the legal particulars. I just know I received a telegram from Chicago requesting assistance in apprehending a fugitive. The description matches Jake here, and the charges are serious. Sheriff, Clara said carefully. May I see the telegram? Morrison handed over a crumpled yellow paper. Clara read it quickly, her mind racing through the legal implications. This telegram is from a private citizen, not from any official law enforcement agency. It has no legal standing whatsoever. The man's a banker, Thomas protested, a respected member of the business community. The man's the father of a woman who tried to have Jake committed to steal his inheritance, Clara replied sharply. This is a personal vendetta, not a criminal matter. Thomas's face reddened. You're defending a fraud, Clara. This man has been lying about his identity, living under a false name. Using a shorter version of his legal name isn't fraud, Clara interrupted. And even if it were, it wouldn't give you or anyone else the right to steal his property. What property? Thomas's voice was too innocent, too carefully modulated. Far as anyone knows, Jake Thornton is just a squatter on unclaimed land. Clara felt pieces clicking into place in her mind. How do you know about the land, Thomas? Jake's ownership isn't common knowledge. Thomas's mask slipped slightly. That is, my father's bank has been researching investment opportunities in the area, mining claims, potential development. Your father's been investigating Jake's holdings. Clara's voice was deadly quiet. How? Now see here, Clara. How, Thomas? Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. If you folks don't mind, I'd like to sort this out without any more shouting. Jake, I'm going to need you to come to town with me. We'll wire the territorial capital, get this straightened out proper. No. Clara stepped between Jake and the sheriff. You don't have a valid warrant, Sheriff. You don't have proper extradition papers. You have a telegram from a private citizen making unsubstantiated accusations. Clara, I don't want to arrest you for interfering with official business. Then don't. Clara pulled her father's badge from her pocket. The honorary deputy's star Judge Mitchell had worn during his tenure. I'm invoking my father's authority as a territorial legal representative. This man is under my protection pending proper legal review. It was a bluff, and Clara knew it. Her father's badge gave her no actual authority, but in the confusion of territorial law and the sheriff's obvious uncertainty, it might buy them time. Thomas exploded. This is ridiculous. Clara, you can't seriously. I can and I am. Clara turned to face him fully. Thomas, I want you off this property, now. It's not his property, that's the whole point. Jake spoke for the first time since Thomas had made his accusations. Actually, it is my property. Legal deed, properly. Filed, purchased with legitimately earned money. If you'd like to challenge that, Mr. Brennan, you're welcome to do so through proper legal channels. We will, Thomas snarled. My father's already contacted lawyers in Denver. By the time we're finished, you won't own so much as the clothes on your back. After the sheriff and Thomas left, Morrison clearly relieved to postpone the confrontation. Thomas furious but outmaneuvered. Clara and Jake sat in silence, processing the implications of what had just occurred. They know about the money. Jake said finally, more than that, they've been investigating your background probably for weeks. Clara paced the small cabin. Thomas knew about the land deed before tonight. His father's been planning this. Planning what exactly? To steal your property. If they can prove you're not legally entitled to hold land under the name Jake Thornton, they can claim it was improperly acquired. Then they file a claim under territorial homestead laws and take everything. Jake's jaw was tight with anger, just like Sarah's family tried to do in Chicago. Clara stopped pacing and faced him. Jake, we need to file papers immediately, establishing your legal identity and your right to the property under both names. We need to beat them to the territorial office. That means going to Denver, exposing myself to exactly the kind of scrutiny I've been avoiding. Yes, but it also means protecting what we've built here, what we're planning to build. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Clara, if this goes wrong, if they succeed in taking the land, the money, then we'll figure out something else. But Jake, if we don't fight this, if we let them steal from you because you're afraid to defend yourself, then they win. Not just the money and the land, but your life, your freedom, your right to exist as who you choose to be. And if fighting means losing you, if the scandal, the attention, Clara moved to him, taking his hands in hers. You won't lose me. Whatever comes, we face it together. Jake looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, we go to Denver. We file the papers, establish everything legal and proper, and then we come home and build our school, show these people that love and determination are stronger than greed and prejudice. As they prepared for what would likely be the fight of their lives, Clara felt her father's watch ticking steadily in her pocket. Time was moving forward, carrying them toward whatever came next. But for the first time since this all began, she felt truly ready for the future, whatever it might bring. The real battle was just beginning, but they would face it as partners, as equals, as two people who had chosen each other against all odds and wouldn't be separated by anyone's schemes or prejudices. Jake's rifle felt familiar in his hands as they rode hard toward Pine Ridge, the Denver-bound stagecoach visible in the distance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley, and Clara could feel the weight of everything they were fighting for, pressing down on them like an approaching storm. They'd discovered Thomas and his father's treachery too late. While Clara and Jake had been planning their legal strategy, the Brennans had been moving faster, heading to Denver with forged documents and falsified evidence designed to prove Jake's mental incompetence and Clara's manipulation by a dangerous madman. There, Jake pointed to a rise overlooking the main road. We can intercept them before they reach the courthouse. Clara checked the legal documents in her saddlebag one more time. The original land deed, Jake's military records, and the certificate of his grandfather's estate that proved the legitimacy of his inheritance. Everything they needed to expose the Brennans' fraud was there if they could get to Denver first. The sound of gunfire cracked across the valley. Jake pulled up short, his eyes scanning the road ahead where the stagecoach had stopped. Armed men on horseback surrounded it, and Clara could see passengers being forced out at gunpoint. Bandits, Jake said grimly, or worse. What do you mean worse? Jake's expression was dark. Could be Brennan hired them? Eliminate the competition permanently. Claim the bandits killed us both. Clara felt ice in her veins. You think Thomas would go that far? For $50,000 in silver rights? Plus your father's property that would come to him as your husband? Jake checked his rifle. Men have killed for much less. The lead bandit was shouting orders Clara couldn't quite hear, but his intentions were clear enough. The passengers were being robbed, and the driver was bleeding from a head wound. Jake, we have to help them. I know. Jake's voice carried the same steel Clara had heard when he talked about his war service. But Clara, if shooting starts, I know how to use a rifle. Father made sure of that. Jake looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Stay behind cover. Don't try to be a hero. That's your job, remember? Despite everything, Jake smiled. Right. Try to keep up. They approached, from the high ground, using the rocks and scattered pines for cover. Clara counted at least 6 bandits, all armed and jumpy, with the kind of nervous energy that made trigger fingers unpredictable. Jake moved with the fluid grace of a man born to this kind of work. Clara watched him position himself with clear sight lines, calculating angles and distances with the precision of someone who'd done this before under much worse circumstances. When I start shooting, he whispered, You circle around to the stagecoach. Get those people to cover. What about you? I'll keep the bandits busy. Jake's first shot took down the bandit leader, dropping him from his horse before he even knew he was being hunted. The others scattered, looking for cover, shouting confused orders at each other. Clara ran low and fast toward the stagecoach, where terrified passengers huddled behind whatever protection they could find. Among them, to her shock, was Mrs. Henderson, from Pine Ridge, clutching a carpet bag and praying loudly. "Mrs. Henderson, are you hurt?" "Clara Mitchell, what in heaven's name? Are you hurt?" Clara repeated urgently. "No, but the driver—" Clara looked at the wounded man slumped against the stagecoach wheel. Blood ran from a gash on his forehead, and his breathing was shallow. "We need to get him to town." More gunfire erupted from the rocks above. Jake was keeping the bandits pinned down, but Clara could see at least two of them trying to flank his position. "Mrs. Henderson, can you drive a team?" What? Can you drive this stagecoach?" "My late husband taught me, but—" "Good enough." Clara helped the wounded driver into the passenger compartment. "Get everyone to town. Send the sheriff back here with men." "What about you?" Clara checked her rifle and started climbing toward the sound of gunfire. "I'm not leaving Jake." She found him behind a boulder, methodically picking off bandits who showed themselves. His movements were calm, professional, terrifying in their efficiency. "I told you to go with the stagecoach," he said, without taking his eyes off his targets. "And I told you I'm not leaving." Clara settled beside him, scanning the terrain. "Two more circling left, one trying to get behind us." "I see them." Jake's next shot sent the flanking bandit tumbling down the slope. "Clara, if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you. But if it does, you ride hard for Denver. File those papers, protect the land. Don't let the Brennans win. We're both going to Denver. We're both going to file those papers. And we're both going to build that school." Clara fired at a muzzle. Flash, earning a yelp of pain from their target. "Together!" Jake looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara saw something new in his eyes. Not just love or admiration, but recognition, partnership, equality. "Together," he agreed. The remaining bandits, reduced to 3 and thoroughly outgunned, finally broke and ran. Jake let them go, more concerned with checking on Clara than pursuing men who no longer posed a threat. "You're hurt," Clara noticed. "Blood on his sleeve. Graze, you." "Fine." Clara looked at the scattered remains of what had been an ambush. "Think they were working for Thomas?" "We'll find out. But first we ride to Denver, fast." As they mounted their horses, Clara realized something had changed in the last hour. They'd faced real danger together, trusted each other with their lives, and emerged stronger. Whatever waited for them in Denver, whatever legal battles lay ahead, they would face them as true partners. The ride to Denver had never seemed more urgent or more possible. The territorial courthouse in Denver was the imposing brick building that smelled of leather, tobacco, and the particular mustiness that came from rooms where important decisions were made. Clara clutched the legal documents as they climbed the steps, knowing that everything they'd built together depended on the next few hours. They'd beaten the Brennans to Denver by half a day, riding hard through the night and arriving dusty, exhausted, but determined. Jake had traded his mountain clothes for a proper suit purchased from a Denver tailor, and the transformation was startling. Dressed like a gentleman, with his military bearing and obvious education, he looked every inch the successful businessman. He actually was Mr. Williams, the territorial clerk said, examining Jake's military records. "These appear to be in order. Medal of Honor recipient, honorably discharged. No criminal record on file with federal authorities." "That's correct," Jake replied calmly. "And Miss Mitchell, you're serving as Mr. Williams's legal representative?" "I am. My father was Judge Henry Mitchell of Pine Ridge. I'm familiar with territorial property law." The clerk nodded respectfully. Judge Mitchell's reputation had reached even Denver. "What exactly are you filing today?" Clara spread the documents across the clerk's desk. Legal name verification for Jacob Williams, also known as Jake Thornton. Property deed confirmation. For approximately 2,000 acres in Pine Ridge County, including mineral rights. And formal notification of intent to establish an educational institution on said property. The clerk examined each document carefully. Everything appears to be in order. I'll need to record these officially, and the courthouse doors burst, open with a bang that echoed through the hall. Thomas Brennan strode in, flanked by his father and a man in an expensive suit who could only be their Denver lawyer. "Stop this proceeding immediately," the lawyer declared. "We're here to contest these filings on grounds of fraud and mental incompetence." Clara felt her heart sink, but Jake remained perfectly calm. "On what evidence?" The lawyer produced a thick folder. "We have sworn affidavits from Chicago regarding Mr. Williams's mental state. Evidence of violent behavior and documentation proving he obtained his inheritance through fraudulent means." "May I see these affidavits?" Clara asked coolly. The lawyer hesitated. "They're confidential medical. Nothing filed in a territorial court proceeding is confidential from the opposing party," Clara interrupted. "I have a right to examine any evidence presented against my client." The territorial clerk nodded. "Miss Mitchell is correct. All evidence must be made available for review." Reluctantly, the lawyer handed over the documents. Clara read through them quickly, her legal training immediately spotting the irregularities. "These affidavits are unsigned," she announced. "No medical professional has actually put their name to these claims. The doctors wish to remain anonymous to avoid retaliation." Anonymous. "A testimony has no legal standing in territorial courts," Clara replied firmly. "Furthermore, these alleged incidents took place in Illinois, outside territorial jurisdiction for mental competency determinations." Thomas stepped forward, his face red with frustration. "Clara, you're making a mistake defending this man. He's dangerous, unstable." "Mr. Brennan," Jake said quietly, "I think it's time we discuss the real reason you're here." Jake reached into his coat and produced a telegram. "This arrived this morning from the Pine Ridge Sheriff. It seems several of the bandits who attacked the stagecoach yesterday have been apprehended. Under questioning, they revealed who hired them." Thomas went pale. "That's impossible, is it?" Jake's voice was dangerously quiet. "Because according to their testimony, they were paid to eliminate Clara and myself before we could reach Denver. Paid by someone who knew exactly when and where we'd be traveling." The lawyer looked shocked. "Thomas, you didn't tell me about any—" "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas blustered. Clara stepped forward. "The bandits also revealed the location where they were told to dispose of our bodies. A mine shaft on land that the Brennan Bank has been quietly surveying for mineral deposits." The territorial clerk looked between the parties with growing concern. "Are you suggesting this is attempted murder?" "I'm suggesting," Clara said, "that Mr. Thomas Brennan and his father have been engaged in a conspiracy to fraudulently claim my client's property through a combination of legal manipulation and violence." She produced another document from her bag. "This is a surveyor's report filed by the Brennan Bank 3 weeks ago, detailing the mineral wealth of land they believed was unclaimed. Land that has been legally owned by Mr. Williams for 3 years. The elder Brennan finally spoke. "This is all speculation and hearsay, is it?" Jake's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Because I have here a signed confession from your surveyor, admitting that you instructed him to falsify records showing the land as unclaimed territory." The confession was Jake's masterstroke. While Clara had been gathering legal documents, Jake had been conducting his own investigation, using his military connections and the resources his wealth provided. The lawyer looked at his clients with growing alarm. "Gentlemen, if these allegations are true—" "They're not true," Thomas exploded. "Clara, you're destroying your own reputation defending this fraud. When this is over, when the truth comes out, no respectable man will have you." Clara felt something cold and final settle in her chest. Thomas, let me be perfectly clear. I wouldn't marry you if you were the last man in Colorado Territory. I'd rather spend my life alone than spend a single day pretending to love someone I despise. Thomas lunged forward, his hand raised as if to strike her. Jake moved faster than Clara had ever seen him move, catching Thomas's wrist in a grip that made the younger man cry out in pain. "Touch her," Jake said in a voice like winter wind, "and you'll discover exactly how dangerous I can be." The territorial clerk banged his gavel. "That's enough. Mr. Brennan, you're in contempt of court. Sheriff!" As the courthouse sheriff moved to restrain Thomas, his father tried one last desperate gambit. "This is all a misunderstanding. Perhaps we can reach some accommodation. The only accommodation," Clara said clearly, "is your complete withdrawal of all claims against Mr. Williams's property, a formal apology filed with this court, and your agreement to face charges for conspiracy and attempted murder." The elder Brennan looked at his son, then at the evidence arrayed against them, and finally at his expensive lawyer, who was already backing away from his clients. "We withdraw our claims," he said heavily. The territorial clerk stamped Jake's documents with official seals. "Mr. Williams, your property rights are hereby confirmed and recorded. Miss Mitchell, your educational charter is approved pending inspection of facilities." As the Brennans were led away, Thomas still protesting his innocence, his father looking defeated, Clara and Jake found themselves alone in the courthouse hall. "It's over," Clara said softly. "No," Jake replied, slipping a simple gold ring from his pocket. "It's beginning." He knelt before her in the marble hallway, and Clara felt her heart stop. "Clara Mitchell, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another human being. You've seen me at my worst and my best, and somehow you've chosen to stay. Will you marry me?" Clara looked at this man who had risked everything for her, who had fought beside her, who had trusted her with his deepest secrets and fears. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes." When Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. They kissed in the territorial courthouse, surrounded by the echoes of their victory and the promise of everything that lay ahead. The wedding photograph captured more than just a moment. It captured a transformation. Clara studied it now, 5 years later, seeing not just the bride and groom who had stood in the mountain clearing where they'd first kissed, but the community that had gathered around them. There was Sheriff Morrison, who had become one of Jake's strongest supporters after the truth about the Brennan conspiracy came to light. Mrs. Henderson, who had appointed herself the unofficial historian of their love story, telling anyone who would listen how Clara had saved her from bandits. Sarah Coleman, who had eventually admitted she'd been wrong about Jake and had become Clara's closest friend and the first teacher hired for their mountain school. Even some of the former skeptics had come around. The Thornton Williams Mountain School had become a source of pride for the region, drawing families from 3 counties and earning recognition from the Territorial Education Board. Children who might never have learned to read were now writing letters to their grandchildren in distant cities. Clara touched the simple gold band on her finger, the engagement ring Jake had given her in the Denver courthouse, now accompanied by a wedding ring carved from the same mountain wood he'd used for their chess set. Their marriage had been everything she'd dreamed and nothing like what she'd expected. There had been challenges, of course. Jake's nightmares had returned briefly during their first winter together, triggered by the stress of building the school and the lingering effects of the confrontation with the Brennans. But Clara had learned to be patient during those difficult nights, offering silent comfort until the dreams passed. "Mama, tell us the story again," 8-year-old Mary asked, climbing onto Clara's lap with the persistence only children possessed. Clara smiled at their adopted daughter, one of 3 children they'd taken in over the years. Orphans from mining accidents and failed homesteads who had found their way to the mountain school and into their hearts. "Which story, sweetheart? The one about when you warned Papa about your breath," Clara laughed, looking across the room where Jake sat with their twin boys, helping them with arithmetic homework. At 35, Jake had grown into his role as both teacher and father with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. Silver streaked his temples now, and laugh lines had replaced some of the tension that had marked his features when they'd first met. "Well," Clara began, "it was the night of the big storm." "I love this part," Mary interrupted. "Your mama was very nervous," Jake called from across the room, "because she thought I was this big, scary mountain man." "Were you scary, Papa?" "I was scared," Jake replied honestly. "Scared that someone as wonderful as your mama might see all my flaws and decide to run away." "But she didn't run away," 10-year-old Samuel added from his place at Jake's feet. "No, she didn't. She stayed and helped me remember that being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave." Clara met Jake's eyes across the room, feeling the same flutter of attraction that had surprised her that first night in his cabin. Some things, thankfully, never changed. "Tell about the bad breath part," Mary demanded. "Well," Clara continued, "I was so nervous about kissing your papa that I convinced myself he'd be disgusted by something as silly as bad breath. But Papa didn't care. Papa cared about much more important things," Jake said, setting aside the arithmetic slate to give the story his full attention. "Like how brave your mama was, and how kind, and how she saw the best in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves." The evening ritual of storytelling was one of Clara's favorite parts of their life together. The children, Mary, Samuel, and 6-year-old Joseph, never tired of hearing about their parents' courtship, always requesting new details or asking for clarification about parts they didn't understand. After the children were in bed, Clara and Jake sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge over the mountains that had become their kingdom. The school building was visible in the distance, its windows dark now, but tomorrow filled again with the voices of children learning to read, to write, to imagine futures bigger than the valleys where they'd been born. "Any regrets?" Jake asked. A question he posed periodically, as if he still couldn't quite believe their happiness was real. "Only one," Clara replied, earning a concerned look from her husband. "I wish my father could have met you. I think he would have liked you very much." Jake reached for her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern of the calluses she'd earned from years of mountain life. "I would have liked to meet him too. Ask his permission to marry his daughter properly." "Oh. You would have had his permission." "Father always said the measure of a man wasn't in his words, but in his willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Even when it meant his daughter marrying a man the whole town was afraid of?" Clara laughed. "Especially. Then Father never trusted anything that came too easily." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the mountains, owls calling, wind through the pines, the distant creek that had provided the water for their first shared meal. These sounds had become the soundtrack of their life together, as familiar and comforting as each other's breathing. "Clara," Jake said eventually, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd said yes to Thomas Brennan?" Clara considered this seriously. "I think I would have spent my whole life feeling like I was slowly suffocating, going through the motions of respectability while dying inside from boredom and regret. And if I hadn't been brave enough to fix your fence that day, then I probably would have spent the rest of my life wondering about the mountain man who seemed different from his reputation, never knowing that love could feel like coming alive." Jake lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles. "Good thing we were both brave enough to take a chance on something that seemed impossible." As they prepared for bed, Clara caught sight of her father's pocket watch on the dresser, still ticking steadily after all these years. Time had brought them everything she'd never dared to hope for: love, partnership, purpose, and a family built on choice rather than obligation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: students to teach, a community to serve, children to raise. But tonight, as Jake's arms closed around her and she listened to his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she'd chosen correctly. Love, it turned out, wasn't about perfect moments or flawless people. It was about finding someone brave enough to see past your fears about yourself and being brave enough to see past theirs in return. The last thing Clara heard before sleep claimed her was the sound of her father's watch, marking time in a life that had turned out better than any story she could have imagined.